you have a tendency to be confused. In other words, it's like she's writing poetry that almost is like a puzzle that you have to unpack to try to figure out what's going on. Let's take a look at it. Much madness is divinest sense to a discerning eye, much sense the starkest madness. 'Tis the majority in this, as all prevail. Assent and you are sane, demure, you're straightway dangerous and handled with a chain. Now again, almost every one of these words, with maybe the exception of the word demure, is a word that we're familiar with. And yet when you put these lines together on the page, it can seem somewhat complicated. What exactly is it that Emily Dickinson is suggesting about being crazy versus being sane? She uses the word not crazy, but madness in the first line. What is it that she says? Opening line, madness is really being insane, is really being sane. To a discerning eye means to people who know how to look right. Much sense, sanity, is actually insanity, madness. Who gets to decide? What does the line 4 say? Who gets to decide what's crazy? The majority gets to decide, right? The majority gets to prevail. If you agree with the majority, assent, then you're what? You're sane. If you disagree with the majority,
I'm dangerous.
That's right. You're considered dangerous and therefore insane and handled with a chain. In other words, what do you think Dickinson is saying about the way people kind of follow the group or stand out from the group? We call those people nonconformists, don't we? People
Outsiders.
Outsiders, Mr. Perez says. And sometimes outsiders are seen as dangerous or not dangerous?
Dangerous.
Very dangerous, right? So for example,
misunderstood.
or misunderstood, which leads to being dangerous, absolutely, and therefore often handled with a chain. Dickinson, by the way, was an agoraphobic. She didn't like being in the company of lots of people. She was considered a little bit different, and it would make sense then that this would be a poem that often represents much of what she thinks about the way people think about her. In other words, just because you're different does not mean that you are insane. In fact, she will argue being different from the group proves your sanity. When you agree with everything the majority says, that's proof that you are really what? Insane, right? Not sane, right? If you're agreeing with the majority all the time. All right, let's go on to Ozymandias 758. And again, I hate that we have to move so quickly through these, but it allows us to at least be able to have some ways to talk about these poems quickly. I want to point out right away that this poem by Percy Bysshe Shelley was a near contemporary of Wordsworth. The world is too much with us, late and soon, getting and spending we lay waste our powers, little we see in nature that is ours, the poem we worked with last time. Mr. Perez, by the way, I hope that you were able to study our video online of the last session. Okay. So that way, before you hand in any packet to me, obviously you want to do that so that you can update your annotations, all right? Yeah. Ozymandias is also a sonnet. Do you notice it? How many lines?
14.
There are 14 lines, and notice we have a certain kind of rhythm at play here. I met a traveler from an antique land. Ba-bum, 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 ba-bum. What do we call that? Iambic what? Pentameter. Pen means 5, right? We worked with this last time as well, right? Only this poem is not going to be about love. This is going to be a little bit different kind of poem. Shelley is going to make some interesting observations about people versus nature, fame, and the elusive nature of fame. Marcus Aurelius, the great emperor, said, "Soon you will have forgotten all things, and all things will have forgotten you." This is a poem which seeks to try to kind of teach that truth. In the poem, we're told that a visitor has just returned from Egypt where he saw something quite interesting. Let's read it together. I met a traveler from an antique land who said, 2 vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. Near them on the sand, half sunk, a shattered visage lies, whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command tell that its sculptor well those passions read which yet survive, stamped on these lifeless things, the hand that mocked them and the heart that fed. And on the pedestal, these words appear. My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Nothing beside remains. Round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away. Now, we could point out right away, yes, this is a sonnet, yes, iambic pentameter, yes, it has a certain kind of rhyme scheme. Notice land rhymes with sand, stone with frown, and so on and so forth, right? Notice he says his palace just come back from Egypt, where he saw an amazing sculpture that is in complete disarray. The only thing standing of the sculpture are the legs. What about the top part of the sculpture? Where is it? It's blown over and laying in the sand. The face of this amazing Pharaoh who built huge cities to himself and to his name. What does the face look like? It has a cold sneer. What does that mean? Is he a happy guy or a not so happy guy? What kind of Pharaoh was he?
Mean one.
Mean.
Yeah.
Arrogant. You'll do, well, then there's this little sign at the bottom of the statue. My name is Ozymandias. Look what he calls himself. King of kings. And then it also says, look on my works. What does that mean? All my stuff. Cities, all the stuff I built. Ye mighty and despair. In other words, basically he says what? I'm number, right? Okay, he's taunting the rest of the would-be kings of the world. I am the greatest king of all time. We think, of course, of the great Muhammad Ali, who said, I'm the greatest of all time, don't we? Notice the final lines of the poem. Nothing beside remains. Where is Ozymandias' great cities that he built?
In Egypt.
But where are they now?
They're gone.
They're gone. They're completely gone. Where have they gone?
The sand and stuff.
Right. Right. It's in the desert, right? And the sand has the amazing power to do what? Destroy what humans create. Nothing beside remains. Round the decay. Look what he calls the statue of that colossal wreck. Boundless, right. Boundless and bare. The lone and level sand stretch far away. Now this is an interesting poem to exegete, to discuss. At level 1, we could call this simply a dumb poem about a guy who returns from Egypt and says what? Literally, what does the poem say at level 1? I came back from Egypt and I found down there what? What did he see?
Just
an old ruined statue. That's all. That's all. That's all at level 1, really, this poem is about. But Shelley, the poet, at level 2a, messages, themes, Shelley is saying something quite fascinating. What is Shelley saying that a reader is supposed to understand about this journey this guy took and came back to tell about? What's one possible message from this poem about ambition or fame? Where are all of Ozymandias's...
They're gone.
They're gone.
I was looking to see what I had.
So what's the point of that, though, Miss Trimbat? What point is Shelley making to readers?
That no matter what you do, it
doesn't
usually
last forever.
doesn't last
Nothing
forever.
lasts forever. So what? What's the point of that? What is the instruction to readers of this poem then?
Nothing lasts forever.
Well,
What about yourself? Don't think too what?
too much of yourself.
Don't think too much of yourself. How come? No matter how great you are.
Yeah, it's
Right.
going to come along.
Right. Notice at 3a, I quoted a line from Marcus Aurelius. If you're a Gladiator fan, you love Marcus Aurelius as the old king in the opening of that movie, who was strangled by his son. Marcus Aurelius, one of the greatest Roman emperors of all time, wrote the words I quoted, "Soon you will have forgotten all things,
I've heard that.
and all things will have forgotten you." In other words, no matter how much of a big shot you are, what? What happens to all of it? It
Out of sight,
all
out of mind.
it all goes away. Back to our conversation of last week, everything in the first box, what happens to it all? Even Victoria's Secret models and their beauty, sooner or later, everything sags and bags, it all goes away. Remember, that's what we said, right? Beauty goes away, power goes away. What about wealth? Can you take that with you?
No,
Can't take it with you.
can't.
Notice the Egyptians buried their pharaohs with huge amounts of treasure, but guess what?
Somebody went and found
Right. Tomb raiders found it, not pharaohs. They didn't get to take it.
And
with them.
archaeologists.
Right, and archaeologists might be the same thing, right, Mr. Perez?
Yeah.
Let's now go to two poems that we will take together. 768, go there real quickly. The Last Duchess, 768.
I like this poem.
And Lover, 857. So I'm going to put two poems side by side here real quickly. 857. Porphyra's lover, all right, and My Last Duchess, all right? Now, I want to point out both of these two poems, so you want to have your hymnal open to both pages, 768 and 857. I want to point out that both of these two poems are written by the same cat. His name is what?
Robert Browning.
Browning, that's correct. Robert Browning, okay? Both of these two poems, let's work real quickly, and I see Trimbath with having her annotations side by side. That's a good idea because we're going to work with these together. Both of these two poems are an example of what we call dramatic monologue. Dramatic monologue. Now, if Mr. Perez and I are engaged in dialogue, what does that mean? Dialogue means what? Two people talking.
Quotations.
Correct. What is monologue then?
Monologue.
One person talking. Very good. That's huge. So in each one of these two poems, there's just one person talking, and the reader has to try to guess at what we call the dramatic context. What is going on? Okay. In both of these two poems, we will have a man speaking. All right. And in both of these two poems, the man will be speaking about his girl. In the first poem, Last Duchess, he's speaking about his last wife. Uh-oh, what does it mean, Mr. Perez, if I talk about my last wife? So-and-so was my last wife. What does that mean about her now? She ain't my wife anymore. Either I've divorced her or she's dead. We're going to find out in this poem, Last Duchess, she's dead. She's been dead for some time. And the guy is looking for a new wife, which is why he is speaking in the poem. He's speaking to a young servant who has been sent to represent a pretty young girl's and her family, right? And he wants to introduce himself by talking about his last wife. Okay? We will discover in this poem, he gave commands, then all of his wife's smiles stopped, and she ain't around anymore. In other words, there's a real good likelihood that he did what?
Had her killed.
He had her killed. What does he not like about her? Well, that's going to be a really good question. Okay, so as we look at this poem, we're going to ask that question. Dude, what is it that you didn't like about your woman? Was she a really nasty, gripey, kind of bitchy type of wife, and you didn't? No. We're going to find out she smiled all the time. Uh-oh, smiled too much. Smiled at everyone. Smiled at lots of guys. What kind of guy do we have speaking in this poem? Jealous guy. You got it. A really jealous guy. He is very arrogant because he has money and power, right? He's been a wealthy man and had wealth in his family for a long time. He couldn't believe that his wife didn't understand. You don't smile at other men. You only smile at me. He couldn't understand this, and it frustrated him, so he had her killed. Porphyra's Lover is a very disturbing poem that tells about a morose guy who waits for his girl, not his wife, to come in from being out at the prom or the party, and she shows up. She has long what?
Oh, yellow hair.
Long, beautiful blonde hair. He is very unhappy about the way she has showed up from being most likely with somebody else. And he decides he needs to do something to solve the problem. In both of these poems, Miss Trimbath, we have a guy that does what?
Kills his woman.
In both of these poems, we have an example of a guy who kills the woman. Yeah. In both cases, it is an act of jealousy. It is an act of passion. And most disturbing with Porphyra's Lover, it is not premeditated. He doesn't sit around thinking what to do. It is an impulsive act. And by definition, then, very disturbing to both male and female readers of the poem. Now, what's going on with Browning, and why is it that this is such disturbing stuff? Browning is writing during a time in English history where men and women are beginning to challenge each other for equality. Guys and girls are starting to redefine sexual roles, and it's a disturbing time, therefore, in English history. So Browning is playing a very interesting game, as he is going to have male speakers say out loud, yeah, I killed her, so what? What are you going to do about it? That's actually how Porphyria's lover ends. What are you going to do about it? God hasn't said anything about what I've done. She's fine. She's sitting here with me right now. She's fine. Which is going to raise eyebrows in England, as you can imagine, right? As readers of these two poems say, what is Browning suggesting? Because he was married and very much in love to the woman he was married to. In this regards, let's point out, Browning is clearly critiquing the patriarchal, misogynist kinds of views that many men have towards their women. That is to say, I tell them what to do. If they don't do it, I what? I jack them. You got it, I jack them. To that degree, both of these poems are not actually so much about violence towards women as they are messages against violence towards women, by representing men who clearly have issues, right? Because in the first poem, Last Duchess, the woman smiles too much. In the second poem, she's been gone without him there. Very jealous guy, right? He doesn't believe that she should be out going to parties without him there. There also seems to be, in both of these poems, a class distinction where both of the women seem to be a different kind of class from the speaker. In the first poem, Last Duchess, it's fairly clear that he's maybe a little bit more famous in terms of class, upper class, than she is, right?
Right.
In the second poem, it kind of seems to appear that maybe she has a little bit more kind of class than he does, and he doesn't like that fact. She, in other words, maybe thinks she's a little bit better, right? All right, let's go to Dover Beach real quickly, page 813, and I'll talk about Matthew Arnold's classic poem real quickly. 813. This is a very famous poem as well that speaks directly to some of the concerns of the day. Let's outline what those concerns are. Again, this is on page 813, Dover Beach. Arnold is very concerned about the end of the time of religious power. Arnold's fairly conservative in his view. He will argue there's something wrong with England, and it is simply this: the sea of faith, religion, and religious beliefs is starting to go away. And what is left are people who are lost and confused. His word picture at the very end of the poem says everything. Guy speaking to his girl. Again, by the way, this is another example of a dramatic monologue. Guy speaking to his girl says, "Ah, love," I'm on page 814, "let us be true to one another. For the world which seems to lie before us like a land of dreams, so various, so beautiful, so new, hath really neither joy, nor love, nor light, nor certitude, nor peace, nor help for pain. And we are here as on a darkling plain, swept with confused alarms of struggle and flight, where ignorant armies clash by night." His word picture of the human condition is two armies fighting, but it's in the middle of the night with no light. In other words, what does he say about the human condition and what is missing? Notice what he says. There is no joy.
Faith.
There is no love. There is no light. Does that mean there's no fluorescent lights in the time he's... No, speaking in metaphor. What's it mean there's no light?
No sun.
No sun, meaning what? Clearly there has to be sun, Mr. Perez, literally.
There's no day. It's not.
Metaphorically, what does he mean? He clearly can't mean literally there's no light, correct? He can't mean there's no sunlight. What does he mean when he says there's no light?
Like there's no hope.
No hope. That would be a way for us to say, good, no hope. No certitude. What does it mean to be certain? If I'm certain about something, I don't know, or am I for sure?
For sure.
There is no for sure.
Yes.
He says there's no for sure. Why are all of these things happening? Because of a lack of the ability to believe in religion. That will be Matthew Arnold's view. As people become less religious, they become less capable of certainty, of hope, of love, of joy, and peace. Notice the irony. He says there's no more love in the world, and yet look what he calls this girl. The last stanza begins with what words? Love. Let us be true to one another. In other words, even though there's no one who believes in being true anymore, let's still be true to one another. Note the paradox of this poem then. The hyperbole, the exaggeration. Nobody loves anyone anymore, but we should still try to love each other. Make sense?
Yes.
Finally, we'll look at Keats's poem 884, Homer. And this is our first introduction to Keats. I'm kind of setting you up to our conversation on Tuesday about Ode on a Grecian Urn. So you should now be at that annotation. The first thing I want to say about this poem is that this poem by John Keats, Keats is a contemporary of Percy Shelley, who wrote Ozymandias. Okay, they live at the same time. As a matter of fact, when Shelley dies, are you ready for this bit of trivia? So that next time you play trivia, you can win, Mr. Perez. When Shelley dies, he dies in a boating accident where he's all alone and the boat sinks and he drowns. He washes up on the shore, and guess what they find inside of his pocket, of his coat?
A poem?
A collection of poems by John Keats. John Keats, interestingly, had great admiration as well for Shelley and Shelley's work. So they were kind of admirers of each other. Keats writes some of the most famous sonnets in the English language. Notice this is a sonnet. Do you see 14 lines? Do you see a rhyme scheme, right? Gold, hold, seen, been. Of course, been would be the pronunciation in the English, correct? In the British English. Much have I traveled in the realms of gold, and many goodly states and kingdoms seen. But if we slow that down and study the iambic rhythm, right? You can begin to hear it. Which bards in fealty to Apollo hold, ba-bum, 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 ba-bum. Hear it? That's that 5 again. Iambic pentameter 5, right? What's cool about this poem is the background story. This is a poem that requires that you know a little bit of background. Keats had a pal who gave him a new translation of Homer's classic poem, the Iliad. Okay? That poem, the Iliad, originally the Iliad was written in what language?
Greek.
Greek. It had to be translated for Keats to read it into the English. The guy who translated it was named Chapman. Okay? Keats's friend hands him a copy of Chapman's Iliad, and he goes away. The next morning he comes back to see if Keats has read any of the new translation. Keats is still in bed. Surprises his friend. Sitting on the living room table, an envelope, and on the back of the envelope some words are scribbled. Those words, this poem. In one evening, Keats read the entire Iliad. He was a great reader of books. And after he finished reading, because he read it all night, he didn't go to sleep, he wrote 14 lines about what it was like to read this new translation of Chapman. The poem then becomes published, and it is one of the great poems about reading and why reading is so wonderful. Let's listen to what Keats will say about reading. Right away though, very interesting. Keats doesn't talk about reading, he talks about traveling. Now what's ironic about that is that Keats never traveled anywhere until at the very end of his very young life. He dies at the age of 24. At the end of his life, he's coughing up blood because he has tuberculosis, and to try and save his life, he leaves England and he goes to Rome. He dies in Rome, the only time he ever traveled in his life. And yet note the irony of the opening lines. Much have I traveled in the realms of gold. In other words, and many goodly states and kingdoms seen. I've seen so much of the world Anyone that knew Keats knew that this was ironic. He'd never traveled anywhere. Round many western islands have I been, which bards, that means poets, in fealty to Apollo hold. And all of a sudden, an astute reader of this poem realized, oh, he's not talking about physical travel. He's talking about what? Every time you pick up a book and read, it's like going on a journey. And Keats says, I've read a lot of books. One of the reasons, by the way, is because from a child on, he had terrible health. And so instead of being able to play outdoors at school, guess what? He's the kid that got sent to the library. And so early on, he learned how to read, and he learned how to travel through reading. He says, oft of one wide expanse that I've been told that deep-browed Homer ruled as his domain. In other words, he says, I had heard about this story, the Iliad, and the Odyssey, and the Greeks, the poems of Homer. He says, yet did I never breathe its pure serene till I heard Chapman speak out loud and bold. Does he like Chapman's translation or hate Chapman's translation? He loves it. Notice he says Chapman's translation awoke in him, allowed him to breathe in the pure, serene smell of the great story of the Iliad. He loves it. Then, he says, once I read this great poem, felt I like, notice a comparison using like or as. What do we call that? A simile. Very good. How does he feel when he reads this amazing poem? Then felt I like some watcher of the skies when a new planet swims into his ken. What does that mean? He says reading a good book for the first time is like looking through a telescope and saying, oh, we got to get that speck off the lens. I thought you cleaned the lens. And the guy says, dude, I cleaned the lens. No, you didn't. Clean it again. And he cleans it. And he's like, no, it's, dude, it's, whoa, 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 whoa. That's no speck on dirt on the lens. What am I looking at for the first time to see a new planet? What does that feeling have to feel like? What do we call that? Discovery? Right. He says when you read something well for the first time, it's like discovering a new planet. Or like stout Cortez, when with eagle eyes he stared at the Pacific, and all his men looked at each other with a wild surmise, silent upon a peak in Darien. Now, let's point out two things. One, you got to understand this to be able to appreciate the final line. Keats got his history wrong. It wasn't Cortez, it was Balboa. But we'll forgive Keats for this little oversight. Who was Balboa? Well, he parked his ship, that landmass that today we call South America. He parked his ship on the eastern side, and he and his buddies started walking. They weren't his buddies for long, because they were walking through jungle. And it was horrific jungle, horrific. Several times they try a mutiny. They say, dude, we have got to go back. Balboa keeps saying, no, 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 I know. We just got to keep going just a little bit more, just a little bit more. They walk for weeks and then months, several days at a time, not seeing the sun because the canopy of the forest is so dense, right? Many of the men dying, etc. Finally blew through the trees. They're on the place that we call Darien, off to the, now we're on the western side of that, South America. From the east to the west, they walk all the way across, and for the first time break through the foliage and see for the first time the Pacific Ocean. Westerners for the first time seeing that huge expanse of ocean. What must that have been like, Keats asks. Well, he says, it must have been Cortez or Balboa standing there with his eagle eye, staring at the Pacific, and all his men looking at each other with a wild surmise. But they're silent upon that peak in Darien. In other words, when you come up against a great work of literature, it's like seeing the Pacific for the first time. What is that like? What do you imagine what was going through Balboa's mind and those guys when they saw it for the first time? Why? Well, the assumption was that the world kind of flat. We don't know what's on the other side of this landmass. And then all of a sudden you walk and you hit this amazing expanse of ocean, right? The Pacific Ocean, which is a huge body of water. You can take off from Los Angeles Airport and fly at 600 miles an hour for over 12 hours, and you're still over that ocean before you hit any kind of real landmass. That's just mind-boggling how big it is, right? So in other words, what is he saying about reading and great reading? When you stumble upon a great read, It's like traveling to read great books. But when you stumble upon a great read, it's like seeing a planet for the first time. The awe, the excitement, or seeing the Pacific Ocean for the first time. Reading as discovery, reading as exploration. Any of us that love to read love this poem. I've often asked my high school students to memorize this poem as a way to be reminded of what great reading is. To find a great poem, to find a great book, is like discovering again not only the world, but yourself for the first time. That's kind of exciting. And in a 10-20 class, where we have to read all this stupid poetry anyway, it's fun to at least read one poem by a poet who says, sometimes reading can be more than the exercise. Sometimes reading can actually transform the way you see the world, the way you see yourself. Now, let's point out, not all poems will do that the same way. For example, you might not resonate with a lot of the stuff we read here, but there might be other stuff that you read, where you read it and it kind of changes the way you think about yourself and the way you think about the world. Keats says if you've done that at all once in your lifetime, that is a tremendous gift. Do you think in the rest of his life, Balboa ever again had that feeling? Probably never again, right? Because you only get that feeling every once in a while where you look out on a new ocean, a new body of water, and you go, holy crap. I guess there's more world than we thought there was. Correct? See how that works? So in other words, to be able to stumble on one good reading in your life is sometimes going to be a really remarkable thing. Well, there you go. We looked at a lot of different poems this evening. Some of them will have different kinds of takes. Observation, Ms. Trimbat.
Okay, my niece's name is Darian, but what does it mean in this poem?
I had
never gotten
is
this
a
far.
physical structure. It's a mountain right on the western coast of South America. And it's a little mountain that looks out over the Pacific Ocean. And walking across the landmass east to west, Darien is where they pushed through the forest and came out to the jungle and came out to see the actual ocean. You can still visit Darien Peak today, of course. Yeah.
Really?
And people do, who love this poem and want to experience again what Balboa, not Cortez, but Balboa discovered. Keats got his history a little bit wrong, but we forgive him because of the amazing poem that he wrote. Now, that's just setting you up for the poem on 917. The poem on 917 is maybe one of the most famous poems ever written by Keats or anybody else in the English language, called Ode on a Grecian Urn. I really recommend that you do some background reading to try to help you understand a little bit more what's going on when you look at this poem. This is one that we'll work with next time. All right? Questions, observations?